The palace did not announce it with a statement. There was no dramatic confrontation in a corridor, no raised voice behind a closed door, no official confirmation that anything unusual had happened at all. And yet, according to whispers now moving through royal circles, something small but deeply symbolic may have taken place just before Princess Anne's event. A guest list was quietly revised. Certain names connected to Queen Camilla's social orbit were allegedly removed. And Prince William's hand was said to be behind the change. On the surface, it sounds almost trivial. A few invitations adjusted. A few seats no longer needed. A few familiar faces suddenly absent from a royal occasion. But inside the British monarchy, guest lists are never just guest lists. They are maps of influence. They show who is trusted, who is being elevated, who is being tolerated, and sometimes who is being pushed toward the edge of the room without a word being spoken. That is why this rumor has attracted so much attention. Because if William truly intervened before an event associated with Princess, and it would not simply be about Camilla's guests. It would be about control. It would be about the future shape of the monarchy. And most of all, it would be about whether the quiet discipline of William and is beginning to overpower the softer, more socially connected world that Camilla has spent years building around the king. To understand why this matters, you have to understand Princess Anne's place within the royal machine. Anne is not a decorative royal figure. She is not someone who needs cameras, headlines, or emotional speeches to prove her value. For decades, she has built her reputation on work, punctuality, restraint, and duty. She has never seemed interested in court glamour. She does not chase popularity. She rarely explains herself. And that is exactly why many people see her as one of the last surviving examples of the old royal code. Show up, do the work, keep quiet, and never allow the institution to look smaller than the people inside it. In that world, guest lists matter because events are not private parties. They are public symbols. Every person invited into the royal frame becomes part of the message. And if Anne's event was meant to represent service, order, discipline, and continuity, then anyone seen as too political, too socially ambitious, or too closely tied to internal palace tension could become a problem before the first handshake even happened. That is where William enters the story. The Prince of Wales has spent the past few years moving carefully, but not passively. He rarely attacks directly. He does not need to. William's style of power is quieter than that. He watches. He waits. He allows other people to reveal themselves. Then, when he moves, the move often looks administrative rather than emotional. A schedule changes. A role is narrowed. A briefing disappears. A guest list is refined. And suddenly everyone understands that a boundary has been drawn. This is why the alleged removal of Camilla-linked guests feels so significant to royal watchers. It would fit the pattern of a future king who understands that monarchy survives not only through tradition, but through message control. William knows that every image from a royal event can be studied, interpreted, weaponized, and turned into a story. He also knows that the monarchy, after years of family scandals and public mistrust, cannot afford unnecessary distractions around its most disciplined working figures. For Camilla, however, such a move would be deeply uncomfortable if true. Her influence has never depended on the same kind of public affection that surrounded Diana, nor on the constitutional destiny that surrounds William. Camilla's power has always been more personal, more social, more rooted in networks of loyalty, old friendships, private understanding, and proximity to King Charles. For years, her supporters have framed her as steady, loyal, and essential to the king's emotional stability. But that kind of influence can become fragile when the next generation begins to define the monarchy's future. William does not owe his position to Camilla's circle. Princess Anne does not appear needed. And if Anne's event became the place where Camilla's guests were quietly filtered out, then the message would be unmistakable. The monarchy's future may not be built around access to Charles anymore. It may be built around who William and believe strengthens the crown. What makes this alleged moment even more dramatic is the silence surrounding it. Silence in royal life is rarely empty. It is often the language of discipline. No denial can sometimes mean the palace does not want to give a rumor more oxygen. No confirmation can mean the matter is too sensitive to touch. And no visible reaction from Camilla does not necessarily mean she was unaffected. In the royal world, humiliation is rarely public. It is managed through smiles, appearances, and carefully timed absence. If her guests were indeed removed, Camilla would understand the meaning immediately. This would not be a logistical adjustment. It would be a signal that William is no longer merely waiting for his turn. He is already shaping the conditions under which that future will arrive. And that is why his event suddenly becomes more than an event. It becomes a stage where three forms of royal power appear at once. Anne's authority through duty, Camilla's influence through access, and William's control through the future. No crown had to be placed on anyone's head for the balance to shift. No public argument had to erupt for the room to feel different. Sometimes the most important royal battles happen before the doors open, before the cameras arrive, before the guests step onto the lawn. Sometimes the real story is not who stands beside the royal family. It is who is no longer allowed to stand there at all. The most dangerous thing about a royal guest list is that it looks harmless from the outside. To the public, it is just a collection of names, titles, charities, patrons, donors, old friends, and familiar faces. But inside the palace, it is closer to a battlefield drawn in polite ink. Every invitation says something. Every absence says even more. When a person is invited, they are being recognized. When a person is placed near a senior royal, they are being trusted. When a person appears in photographs, they become part of the visual history of the monarchy. And when someone is quietly removed before an event, the message travels through the institution long before the public ever notices. That is why the alleged decision surrounding Camilla's guests has become such a charged rumor. It is not because those guests themselves necessarily held enormous public importance. It is because their removal, if true, would suggest that someone inside the future king circle is beginning to decide which networks are allowed near the crown and which ones are becoming liabilities. For years, Camilla's position has rested on a delicate arrangement. She could never fully erase the public memory of Diana, and she could never completely control how people felt about her path into the royal family. But she could build something else, a world of acceptance around Charles. She became part of his emotional structure, then part of his public life, then finally part of the monarchy's formal image. Around that image grew a circle of loyal friends, social allies, long-standing acquaintances, and people who understood the language of old aristocratic Britain. In Charles's court, these people often seemed natural. They were part of the air he had breathed for decades. They belonged to the same dinners, the same country houses, the same quiet conversations where influence is rarely announced but often exercised. Under Charles, access could sometimes look like tradition. Under William, it may begin to look like risk. That difference is crucial. William did not grow into royal life with the same emotional dependence on the old social machine. His defining trauma was not exile from aristocratic circles or the struggle to be accepted by the old guard. His defining trauma was the collapse of his parents' marriage under the weight of public obsession, private betrayal, and institutional failure. William learned early that palace decisions can destroy lives when they are made for convenience instead of clarity. He learned that silence can protect the institution, but it can also bury pain. He learned that the people allowed closest to the royal family are never neutral. They influence mood, perception, confidence, and sometimes judgment. So when William looks at a guest list, he may not simply see names. He may see echoes of a system that once failed his mother, strained his father, damaged his brother, and forced him to grow up inside a storm he did not create. This is why Princess matters so much in this story, and represents a form of royal authority that William can respect without fear. She does not appear hungry for influence. She does not compete for emotional centrality. She does not need to surround herself with flattering courtiers to feel powerful. Anne's strength comes from her refusal to turn monarchy into theater. She is often blunt, sometimes severe, but rarely theatrical. And in a period when the royal family has been weakened by personal drama, media battles, memoirs, interviews, and carefully leaked grievances, Anne's discipline has become more valuable than ever. If William sees Anne as a stabilizing pillar, then protecting the atmosphere around her event would not be a minor matter. It would be a strategic necessity. Her event must look clean. It must feel focused. It must not be hijacked by personalities who bring old tensions into a new room. For Camilla, that would be a painful realization, not because she would necessarily expect to control every event, but because being quietly overruled is different from being openly challenged. An open challenge can be answered. A private adjustment cannot. If guests connected to her were removed, she would have no easy way to protest without making the matter look more serious. If she complained, she would appear defensive. If she accepted it, she would appear weaker. If she ignored it, the message would still remain. This is the brilliance and the cruelty of administrative power inside royal life. It gives the appearance of calm while shifting the ground beneath someone's feet. Nobody has to say, "Your influence is being reduced." They simply stop inviting the people who prove it exists. The deeper question is whether this moment signals a larger transition already underway. Charles is king, but William is the future. Camilla is queen, but and is trusted. The monarchy still moves under Charles's reign, but its long-term survival increasingly depends on William's judgment. That creates a strange dual reality inside the palace. Officially, the hierarchy is clear. Emotionally and strategically, it may be more complicated. Staff, advisors, donors, friends, and extended networks all understand that one day William will inherit not just the throne, but the consequences of everything being done now. And when a future king begins to act like a gatekeeper, people notice. They begin adjusting their loyalties before anyone asks them to. They begin reading silences more carefully. They begin asking which invitations matter, which absences are warnings, and which royal events are no longer safe places for old alliances to parade themselves. That is why this alleged removal feels less like gossip and more like a signal flare. It suggests a palace where William is not waiting passively for history to arrive. He is studying the room before he enters it. He is deciding what kind of monarchy he wants to inherit. And perhaps, quietly but unmistakably, he is making clear that not every person who found comfort under Charles will automatically find access under William. Princess Anne's event may have been the immediate setting, but the real story is much larger. It is about succession before succession. It is about power before the crown changes hands. And it is about a future king learning that sometimes the first act of authority is not making a speech, signing a document, or standing on a balcony. Sometimes it is taking a name off a list and letting the silence do the talking. What makes this alleged palace move so explosive is that it does not fit the public image the monarchy tries so carefully to maintain. From the outside, royal events are supposed to look effortless, polished cars arriving at the gates, staff moving with quiet precision, guests smiling as if every detail had been settled weeks before, and senior royals stepping into the frame with the calm confidence of people who represent continuity. But behind that polished surface, nothing is accidental. Every arrival is arranged. Every position is considered. Every handshake has meaning. And every guest who appears near a senior royal is, whether they intend it or not, allowed to borrow a little of the crown's authority. That is why the alleged removal of Camilla-linked guests ahead of Anne's event feels like more than a simple palace correction. It feels like a quiet effort to prevent someone else's network from using Anne's credibility as cover. Princess Anne's credibility is one of the rarest assets left inside the royal family. She has survived decades of change not because she is the most glamorous, not because she is the most beloved in the celebrity sense, and not because she has tried to reinvent herself for every generation. She has endured because the public understands what she represents. She is duty without decoration. She is service without melodrama. She is the royal who arrives early, leaves late, speaks plainly, and expects people around her to understand that public life is not a playground for private ambition. So if certain guests were considered unsuitable for the atmosphere of her event, the question becomes sharper. Were they removed because of protocol, because of optics, or because William and those aligned with him feared that Anne's hard-earned image could be diluted by people whose presence carried the wrong associations? That possibility would explain why William's alleged involvement matters so much. William has become increasingly protective of the monarchy's visual message. He understands that the modern crown does not only survive through law, tradition, or ceremony. It survives through images. A photograph can strengthen trust or reopen old wounds. A casual conversation can become a headline. A guest standing too close to the wrong royal can create an entire week of speculation. And after everything the family has endured, from the breakdown of Harry and Meghan's relationship with the institution to the endless public comparisons between Diana and Camilla, William has reason to fear uncontrolled symbolism. He knows the palace can no longer assume that the public will interpret events generously. Every gesture is questioned. Every smile is examined. Every absence is treated as evidence. In such an environment, controlling the guest list is not petty. It is defensive architecture. Camilla's position in this equation is delicate because she has always lived under the shadow of interpretation. Her supporters may see her as a stabilizing partner to Charles, someone who helped him carry the emotional burden of kingship. Her critics may still see her through the old lens of Diana, betrayal, and the private pain that became public history. But either way, Camilla's circle is never neutral. The people around her can revive old narratives simply by appearing too close to royal power at the wrong moment. And if William is determined to streamline the monarchy's future around discipline, restraint, and public trust, then he may view certain social connections not as harmless friendships, but as reputational baggage. In that sense, the alleged removal of guests would not necessarily be a personal attack on Camilla. It could be something colder, an institutional calculation that her network no longer receives automatic access to every royal space. This is where the tension becomes almost impossible for the palace to discuss openly, because the monarchy cannot admit that it operates through internal boundaries, emotional histories, and competing circles of influence. It must present itself as united. It must appear orderly. It must look as if everyone knows their place and accepts it without resentment. But unity in royal life is often a performance maintained by careful choreography. When the choreography changes, insiders notice immediately. A guest who used to receive an invitation no longer receives one. A familiar face is placed farther away from the main royal figure. A person once considered close to the Queen's circle suddenly finds doors less open than before. None of this needs to become public policy. It simply becomes the new atmosphere. An atmosphere, inside a palace, can be more powerful than an official rule. For Princess Anne, the alleged decision may have been welcome, or at least consistent with how she is believed to view royal duty, and has never seemed comfortable with needless drama. She has always appeared to value clarity over sentiment. If an event carries her name or her presence, it must serve the purpose of the occasion, not the vanity of the guests. That may be why William and Anne are so often imagined as natural allies in stories of royal discipline. They are not identical personalities, but they share a certain intolerance for chaos, and represents the old-school version of that intolerance. Firm, practical, unsentimental. William represents the future-facing version. Careful, image-conscious, strategically controlled. Together, they form a quiet counterweight to any force inside the monarchy that relies too heavily on personal charm, private access, or social entitlement. And that is what makes this rumored moment so damaging for Camilla, if the story is true. It suggests that her influence may still exist, but it can be contained. It suggests that William may respect the king's wife publicly while refusing to let her circle shape the tone of the next reign. It suggests that Anne's events, and perhaps in herself, are being treated as protected ground. Most importantly, It suggests that the monarchy is already sorting itself into the world that comes after Charles. Not openly, not brutally, not with a dramatic declaration, but slowly, quietly, and with the kind of precision that only institutions understand. A guest list changes. A silence follows. A few people realize they're not as close to power as they thought. And somewhere behind palace doors, the future begins to take form before the crown has even moved. By the time the first guests would have arrived, the real drama had already happened somewhere else. That is the strange nature of royal power. The public usually sees the ceremony, but the decisions that shape the ceremony are made long before the doors open. A name removed from a list, a seating position altered, a private instruction passed from one office to another, a quiet message delivered through staff rather than family. These are the invisible movements that reveal who is gaining control. And in this alleged case, the most important detail is not simply that Camilla's guests may have been removed. It is that the removal was said to happen before Princess Anne's event, at precisely the kind of occasion where the monarchy would want no confusion, no distraction, and no reminder of the old emotional wounds still attached to the House of Windsor. In public, the palace would want everything to look ordinary. But inside that ordinary scene, a sharper question would be forming. Who now gets to define what is appropriate around the crown? For William, this question is not theoretical. It is personal, historical, and strategic at the same time. He has spent his entire life watching the monarchy survive crises that began not with constitutional problems, but with private relationships that became public disasters. His childhood was shaped by the war between image and reality. The family smiled for the cameras while the marriage behind the image fell apart. The institution protected itself, but not always the people trapped inside it. Diana's pain became a national story because the palace failed to understand that emotional truth could eventually overpower protocol. William grew up inside that lesson. He saw what happens when the wrong people are allowed too much influence, when appearances are managed too late, when private decisions are made without considering public consequences. So if he now studies every event, every guest, every image with unusual caution, it is not because he is petty. It is because he knows how quickly a small mistake can become a permanent wound in royal history. Camilla, meanwhile, represents the most complicated part of that history. She is not just queen in the formal sense. She is a living reminder of the monarchy's ability to rewrite its own story over time. Once viewed by many as the woman who stood at the center of Charles and Diana's collapse, she was gradually transformed into a respected consort, a loyal partner, and a working royal with her own causes. That transformation was not accidental. It required years of patience, careful public appearances, sympathetic coverage, and the slow normalization of her role beside Charles. But normalization is not the same as complete acceptance. There are still limits. There are still memories. There are still people, especially within William's generation, who may accept Camilla's position without wanting her wider circle to inherit permanent influence. And that distinction may be at the heart of this alleged guest list dispute. William can acknowledge Camilla as queen while still drawing a line around the social machinery that comes with her. Princess Anne's presence sharpens that line, and is one of the few senior royals whose reputation does not depend heavily on palace image-making. She does not need to be softened for the public. She does not need to be constantly reintroduced. Her value is understood because it has been proven through repetition. Engagements, charities, military associations, official duties, and a lifetime of showing up without turning every appearance into a personal drama. That makes her events unusually sensitive. They carry the weight of old-fashioned service. They're not supposed to become playgrounds for internal court politics. If Camilla's guests were seen as potentially distracting, or if their presence risked shifting attention away from its purpose, then William's alleged intervention would become easier to understand. He would not simply be protecting Anne. He would be protecting one of the monarchy's last clean symbols of duty. But there is another layer, and is perhaps the most dangerous one for Camilla. If William can quietly control access around Anne's event, then others inside the palace may begin to understand where the future power center is forming. In royal life, people do not always switch loyalties openly. They drift. They stop calling one office first and begin calling another. They ask whose approval matters before making a move. They notice which requests are answered quickly and which are delayed. They learn which names open doors and which names now create hesitation. If William's office is increasingly seen as the place where final judgment rests, then Camilla's network may begin to shrink without any public announcement. Influence does not always collapse in a scandal. Sometimes it thins out slowly, one unanswered invitation at a time. That would explain why this story feels larger than one event. The monarchy is not only preparing for public ceremonies, it is preparing quietly and inevitably for the next reign. Charles may still sit on the throne, and Camilla may still stand beside him, but everyone understands that William is the future. That future is not abstract. It affects behavior now. Advisors know it. Staff know it. Extended relatives know it. Social allies know it. Even those who appear relaxed at palace gatherings understand that access today does not guarantee access tomorrow. If William is beginning to impose his standards early, then the court is already changing shape before the official transition arrives. And for those tied closely to Camilla's social world, that could be deeply unsettling. They may have believed that closeness to the Queen secured their place. But closeness to Camilla is not the same as trust from William. The alleged removal of guests also reveals something about William's possible governing style as future king. He may not seek revenge in the dramatic sense. He may not publicly humiliate those he distrusts. He may not reopen every old wound with emotional speeches or direct accusations. Instead, his method may be colder, cleaner, and more institutional. He may simply narrow access. He may reduce ambiguity. He may separate personal loyalty from royal function. He may decide that the monarchy cannot afford to be a refuge for every old friendship, every social favor, or every lingering alliance from his father's world. In that sense, William's quietness should not be mistaken for weakness. It may be the very source of his power. He does not need to create a spectacle. He only needs to decide who belongs in the room. And that is why his event becomes such a revealing stage. It brings together the monarchy's past, present, and future in one carefully managed space, and stands for the old discipline that still commands respect. Camilla stands for the complicated compromises that allowed Charles's personal life to become royal reality. William stands for the coming reign, shaped by memory, caution, and a desire to avoid repeating the mistakes that damaged his childhood. If certain guests disappeared from that space, the symbolism is impossible to ignore. The crown may be entering a new phase where emotional closeness to the king is no longer enough, where social access is no longer protected by habit, and where the future king is already deciding which parts of the current court will survive. No one had to announce a purge. No one had to declare a feud. But in the quiet absence of a few familiar faces, the palace may have heard the first unmistakable sound of William's monarchy taking control. What would make this alleged decision so unsettling for Camilla's circle is that it would expose the difference between being protected by the present and being accepted by the future. For years, those close to Camilla may have understood their position through the security of Charles's affection and authority. As long as Charles trusted Camilla, and as long as Camilla stood beside the king, her world carried a certain palace gravity. Invitations followed naturally. Access seemed stable. Familiar names appeared at familiar occasions. The old social network remained close enough to power to feel permanent. But monarchy is never only about the person who wears the crown today. It is also about the person who will wear it tomorrow. And once the future king begins to draw invisible lines, everyone inside that world is forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Royal access can be inherited by blood, but social influence cannot always be inherited by association. That is why the story, if true, would land with such force behind palace walls. It would not merely suggest that William objected to a handful of names. It would suggest that he is no longer willing to let the monarchy's public spaces be shaped by habits formed under his father's emotional reign. Charles's court has always carried a personal atmosphere. It is rooted in old loyalties, long friendships, private understanding, and the emotional architecture of a man who waited a lifetime to become king. William's future court may be very different. It may be leaner, sharper, more controlled, less tolerant of social excess, and far less willing to confuse private comfort with institutional value. If that is the case, then the alleged removal of Camilla's guests ahead of Anne's event becomes a preview of a much broader shift. It hints at a monarchy where the question is no longer who has always been close, but rather who strengthens the crown now. For Princess Anne, that question would probably feel obvious, and has spent her life proving that royalty is not supposed to be a club of personal convenience. It is a burden, a schedule, a duty, and a standard. She belongs to a generation that was trained to believe the institution must remain larger than the individuals inside it. That belief can seem cold, but it is also the reason and continues to be respected even by people who do not follow royal life closely. She does not need people to like every part of her personality. She needs them to understand that she works. And because she works, her events carry a seriousness that cannot easily survive if they are crowded with figures seen as socially ambitious or politically inconvenient. If William wanted to protect that seriousness, and may not have needed to ask, he may have understood instinctively that her event should not become another stage for palace speculation. But the deeper pain for Camilla would be the possibility that Anne and William's interests are beginning to align without her, and has always occupied a strange position in the royal family, close enough to the center to understand everything, but independent enough not to appear consumed by court games. She has seen the family through scandals, divorces, deaths, transitions, and public judgment. She knows what weakens the monarchy. She knows what embarrasses it, and she has never seemed impressed by sentiment when duty is at stake. William, on the other hand, brings a younger and more strategic understanding of public image. He knows the monarchy must survive in an age where every photograph becomes content, every rumor becomes a headline, and every internal weakness can be turned into a global debate. Together, Anne and William represent a form of royal discipline that is both old and new, and supplies the principle. William supplies the future. That combination would be difficult for Camilla to resist openly. If she pushed back against William, she would risk appearing to challenge the future king. If she pushed back against Anne, she would risk appearing to disrespect one of the hardest working members of the family. If she pushed back against both, she would turn a quiet adjustment into a visible fracture. So the only realistic response would be silence, and silence is precisely what makes the story more powerful. In royal politics, not every defeat is announced. Some defeats are absorbed. A smile remains in place. A public appearance continues. The family looks united. But the people who understand the code notice the change. They notice who is absent. They notice whose influence did not protect them. They notice that a queen's preference may still matter, but it no longer automatically decides the room. This is the kind of shift that happens slowly at first, then suddenly feels obvious in hindsight. A few months earlier, no one may have questioned Camilla's guest preferences. A few months later, everyone may be asking whether William approved them. That is how courts change. Not through one dramatic overthrow, but through a series of small recalibrations. The phone call goes to a different office. The briefing is cleared by another advisor. The invitation list is reviewed through a different lens. The old names still exist, but their certainty begins to weaken. For people who built their relevance around proximity to Camilla, this would be a warning. The next reign is not waiting politely outside the door. It is already entering the room through procedure, protocol, and discretion. And perhaps that is the real reason this alleged removal has captured attention. It is not the image of William shouting, because that is not the William being described. It is not the image of Camilla being publicly humiliated, because the palace would never allow such a scene if it could avoid it. The real image is quieter and more devastating. A future king reviewing the space around his aunt's event and deciding that certain people do not belong there. No spectacle, no explanation, no emotional release, just a decision. And in that decision, a new hierarchy becomes visible. Camilla may still be queen, Charles may still be king, and may still be the working royal who refuses drama. But William is beginning to look like the person who decides what the monarchy must become. And once that begins, no guest list in the palace is ever just a guest list again. If the alleged guest list change truly happened, its most important consequence would not be the immediate embarrassment of a few people losing access to Princess Anne's event. The real consequence would be psychological. It would tell every person orbiting the royal family that the old assumptions are no longer safe. For years, many within Camilla's circle may have believed that proximity to her meant protection, that friendship with the queen meant recognition, and that Charles's reign would preserve their place close to royal life. But William's alleged move would interrupt that belief with quiet precision. It would suggest that the future king is not simply inheriting his father's court. He is auditing it. He is looking at the names, the patterns, the loyalties, the risks, and the associations, then deciding which parts of that world deserve to survive into his own reign. That is a very different kind of power from public popularity. It is not loud, it is not emotional, but it is final. For Camilla, the danger is not that William would openly reject her. That would be too explosive, too destabilizing, and too damaging to the image of unity the monarchy still needs. The danger is subtler. William may accept her formal place, while slowly reducing the informal reach of her world. He does not have to challenge her title. He does not have to question her role beside Charles. He does not have to revisit the old Diana wounds in public. He simply has to decide that certain names, certain influences, and certain social habits are not useful to the monarchy he intends to lead. That would leave Camilla in a difficult position. She could remain visible, respected, and formally secure, while the network around her becomes less central. In palace terms, that is not a scandal. It is containment. Containment is often more effective than confrontation. A confrontation creates sympathy for the person being challenged. It gives them a story to tell, an injury to display, a grievance to rally around. Containment offers no such opportunity. It happens through procedure. It arrives as scheduling, protocol, guest management, and internal review. The palace can always explain it as routine. Staff can always say the list was adjusted for space, security, timing, or event focus. No one needs to admit there was a power decision underneath it. But the people affected understand. They know when a door that once opened easily has become harder to pass through. They know when invitations begin arriving less often. They know when the warmth around them has cooled. And they know when the future king's silence has become more important than the current court's comfort. This is where Princess Anne becomes the perfect setting for such a signal. Anne's reputation gives William cover because any move made in the name of protecting her event can be framed as protecting duty itself, and is not associated with frivolity. She is not seen as someone who hosts royal occasions for social theater. Her work carries an austere legitimacy. So if certain guests were removed to keep the event focused, disciplined, and free of unnecessary palace tension, many inside the institution would find that explanation believable. Anne's presence transforms a political move into a principled one. It allows William's alleged decision to appear less like a personal boundary against Camilla and more like a broader defense of royal standards. But beneath that formal logic, the family history remains impossible to ignore. William's relationship with Camilla has always existed in the shadow of Diana. Publicly, he has accepted the reality of his father's marriage and the role Camilla now holds. But acceptance is not the same as emotional surrender. William does not have to relitigate the past to be shaped by it. He does not have to speak Diana's name for her memory to influence his judgment. Every decision he makes about loyalty, access, privacy, and public image is haunted by the lessons of his childhood. He saw how private relationships became institutional crises, He saw how the palace struggled to respond when emotion broke through protocol. And he saw how the wrong kind of influence protected for too long could leave consequences that lasted for decades. That is why the alleged removal of Camilla's guests feels so symbolic. It would represent William taking control of a category of risk that once damaged his family beyond repair. The risk of personal networks becoming bigger than institutional judgment. In the past, the monarchy often tried to manage private complications after they became public. William appears determined to prevent them earlier, before the photograph, before the headline, before the awkward interpretation, before the wrong person appears too close to the wrong royal at the wrong event. That preventive instinct may define his future reign. He may prefer a smaller, tighter, more disciplined monarchy, not only in terms of working royals, but also in terms of social access. Fewer people near the center. Fewer unclear loyalties. Fewer inherited assumptions. Fewer chances for old wounds to reopen. And for the wider palace ecosystem, that would be a warning. The monarchy under William may not reward closeness in the same way Charles's world did. It may not indulge old friendships simply because they are old. It may not allow private emotional history to dictate public royal choreography. It may demand that every person near the crown serve a purpose beyond familiarity. That kind of monarchy could be colder, but it could also be stronger. It could disappoint those who thrived in the warmth of Charles and Camilla's social world, but it might reassure those who believe the crown has been weakened by too much personal drama. In that sense, William's alleged move would not be about revenge. It would be about purification, or at least what he may see as purification, stripping away anything that makes the monarchy look compromised, distracted, or too dependent on private circles. By the end of Anne's event, the public may have seen only smiles, handshakes, formal clothes, polite conversation, and the usual royal choreography. But behind that surface, the absence of certain people may have spoken louder than any speech. Camilla's circle would have received the message, and supporters would have understood the protection. William's advisors would have seen the precedent, and the palace, always sensitive to shifts in gravity, would have felt the future moving slightly closer. Because in royal life, power does not always arrive with a crown. Sometimes it arrives as a revised list, a closed gate, an unspoken instruction, and the sudden realization that the next king is already deciding who will be allowed to stand near the throne. By the time the event ended, nothing may have appeared unusual to the casual observer. The photographs would have shown the familiar language of royal life: polished shoes on palace grounds, controlled smiles, careful handshakes, staff moving discreetly in the background, and Princess Anne carrying herself with the same practical seriousness that has defined her public life for decades. There may have been no visible sign of tension, no dramatic absence obvious enough to create an official scandal, no moment where anyone could point and say, "There, that is where the break happened." But that is precisely what makes this alleged episode so powerful. Royal conflict rarely announces itself in the way ordinary family conflict does. It hides inside manners. It travels through protocol. It appears as calm. And if William truly removed or blocked certain Camilla-linked guests before Anne's event, then the public performance of unity may have concealed a much deeper institutional shift. The old palace world has always depended on the idea that everyone understands a code. You do not need to say everything aloud. You do not need to issue direct threats. You do not need to embarrass someone publicly to make them understand their position. A changed invitation list can do the work of a confrontation. A missing name can carry the weight of a warning. A person who once expected access and suddenly receives silence learns more from that silence than from any official explanation. This is why the alleged removal matters. It would tell Camilla's circle that their place near royal power is not guaranteed by habit, history, or social confidence. It would tell them that William is watching. It would tell them that Anne's events, and perhaps in herself, are not available as scenery for anyone else's influence. And it would tell the entire court that the next reign is already beginning to establish its rules. For Camilla, the sting would not necessarily come from one event. She has endured worse headlines, harsher public judgment, and decades of comparison to Diana. She knows what it means to be disliked, doubted, and slowly rehabilitated in the public eye. But this would be different because it would not come from the press or the public. It would come from inside the family structure. It would come from the future king's authority, expressed without emotion and without apology. That kind of message is harder to answer. Camilla can survive criticism from outside the palace. She has done it before. But if William begins limiting the reach of her social world from within the institution, then the problem becomes structural. It is no longer about popularity. It is about permission. And permission is the quiet heart of monarchy. Who is permitted to enter? Who is permitted to stand close? Who is permitted to shape the atmosphere around a royal event? Who is permitted to become part of the photographs that later define a moment? Under Charles, Camilla's world may have felt naturally included because Charles's emotional life and royal life have long been intertwined. Under William, that arrangement may face stricter review. William's monarchy, if this alleged moment is any indication, may be less sentimental. It may be less willing to absorb people simply because they have been present for years. It may demand a cleaner line between personal loyalty and public duty. That would be a profound change, not because it destroys Camilla's position, but because it narrows the space around her. Princess Anne's role in this drama is equally important because she represents the standard William may want to restore, and does not sell emotion. She does not turn duty into confession. She does not rely on soft-focus reinvention. She simply works, and in a family often damaged by spectacle, that simplicity has become a form of moral authority. If William protected Anne's event from becoming entangled with Camilla's network, then he was not only defending one occasion. He was defending a model of royalty. Service first, personality second, private alliances last. That model may look severe, but it is also the model that has allowed and to remain respected while others have been consumed by drama. For William, who has seen how quickly royal emotion can become public chaos, Anne's discipline may feel like the safest blueprint available. The larger question is what happens next. If this was only a one-time adjustment, the palace may absorb it quietly and move on. But if it becomes a pattern, then Camilla's circle will begin to feel the ground changing beneath them. Another invitation may not arrive. Another event may be reviewed more carefully. Another familiar guest may find that access has become conditional. Slowly, people will begin to understand that the monarchy is moving from Charles's emotional court toward William's controlled one. They may not say it publicly, but they will behave accordingly. Courtiers are experts at sensing weather before rain falls. They know when power is shifting. They know when yesterday's closeness becomes tomorrow's liability. And they know when a future king is no longer waiting in the background. That is the final meaning of this alleged episode. It is not about whether William wanted to embarrass Camilla. It is not even about whether Princess Anne personally demanded a stricter guest list. The real story is the emergence of a new royal filter. William appears to be asking a question that may define the next era of the crown. Does this person strengthen the institution, or do they merely belong to someone's private circle? If the answer is the second, then access may no longer be automatic. That is a colder monarchy, but perhaps William believes it is the only monarchy that can survive. So while the public may remember Anne's event as another formal royal occasion, insiders may remember it differently. They may remember it as the moment a few missing guests revealed a much larger truth. Camilla still has her crown. Charles still has his reign, and still has a reputation for duty. But William may now have something more consequential than all of them, the power to decide who belongs in the monarchy's future. And sometimes, in royal life, the clear sign of a new era is not the person standing in the photograph. It is the person who was quietly removed before the photograph was ever taken.